tracks. In the immediate vicinity of the reservoir, nothing lives. No soil, no songbirds, no springs, no ferns, no mammals, no flowing river, only rock, sky, and trapped water. As I explored the many thriving canyons of Glen Canyon and researched the politics behind Western water policy, I became convinced that America does not need Lake Powell. What we need is Glen Canyon. A resurrected Glen Canyon serves as a new kind of symbol, not of environmental destruction or of economic might, but of something much greater. It represents the resiliency of life and the hope for a better future.
In the words of Dan Beard, former commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation, the lake is lower now than anybody ever imagined and provides a new reality about what is possible. It's time for the federal government to consider operating the dam in a different way so that we can protect what's been uncovered. A national decision to protect a restored Glen Canyon not only involves embracing a place, but also a new way of living in the American West that puts environmental sustainability above the drive for short-term economic growth. As David Brower inspired us in his book, The Place No One Knew, we shall seek a renewed stirring of love for the earth. We shall urge that what man is capable of doing to the earth is not always what he ought to do. And we should plead that all Americans here, now, determine that a wide, spacious, untrammeled freedom shall remain in the midst of the American earth as living testimony that this generation, our own, had love for the next. If we are humble enough to simply leave nature alone, to let natural forces begin to repair the damage we have caused, we will witness a miracle of rebirth. John McPhee said, "The most beautiful place in all the region of Glen Canyon was a cavernous space under vaulting rock walls that had been named Cathedral in the Desert. The center of this scene was a slim waterfall, no more than a foot in diameter, that fell 60 feet into a deep and foaming pool." Amazingly, Americans are being given a second chance to not only experience Glen Canyon, but to save it.
Now what, you ask? As the film pointed out, Glen Canyon Institute and other environmental organizations are fighting to gain protection for resurrected sections of Glen Canyon. They argue that Western water policy must be changed to ensure a lower Lake Powell regardless of rainfall. And they urge laws such as the Endangered Species Act, the Wilderness Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act that arose in part from the damming of Glen Canyon should now be tapped to protect it. GCI maintains that it would be far more efficient and better for the restored landscape of Glen Canyon to keep Lake Powell's water downstream in Lake Mead or underground where it wouldn't evaporate. The simple change in policy does not mean that the dam has to be decommissioned or that lake recreation or hydropower would disappear. These things would just take a backseat to the preservation of natural and archaeological resources in Glen Canyon as well as in Grand Canyon. But regardless of how long the current drought continues, communities that rely on distant reservoirs are ultimately doomed, according to water policy expert Daniel McCool. Lake Mead and Lake Powell will fill up with sediment eventually, he says. All these dams are temporary. If we build a society based on water supply from behind dams, we are destined for catastrophe. That's the definition of a society that has outconsumed its habitat. It's like quitting your job and living off savings. Addressing this larger issue requires more than a policy shift of Glen Canyon Dam operations. It requires adopting a new environmentally sustainable standard of living in the American West that allows the planet's wild, natural processes to resume or continue without human meddling. This means that rivers, including the Colorado River, should flow to the sea, and billions of tons of sediment should flow through Glen Canyon. All species should have adequate habitat. The desert should stay dry and the swamps wet, and the Earth's web of life should spin according to its own rhythms. What we are currently witnessing with climate change is truly frightening, and the task of turning the ship around to save human life as we know it may seem overwhelming. But fortunately, we have Glen Canyon to show us the way. The place no one knew that is coming back to life of its own accord is literally and metaphorically our common ground. It is a stage for displacing dysfunctional systems and government policies with a new version of the American dream. Protecting Glen Canyon would not only require owning up to a past mistake, but would by necessity involve revisiting Western water policy, which would lead to a review of what constitutes sound economic development in Western states. In short, a public decision to celebrate and protect the regeneration in Glen Canyon would also be a decision to support a new American West that is based on sustainable practices and economic restraint rather than on unchecked growth at the expense of the environment and taxpayers. Just as the place no one knew helped motivate Americans in the 1960s to fight dams and environmental destruction, our hope is that resurrection will inspire you to give Glen Canyon and the rest of the natural world the protection it deserves. Citizens must lead their government in achieving positive environmental and social change, rather than rely on the policymakers to do it for us. Were it not for citizen resistance to Colorado River dams in the 1950s and 1960s, and the public's refusal to believe these dams were necessary, as was claimed by the federal government, Glen Canyon National Park and Dinosaur National Monument would be flooded today. Perhaps most telling is the regret expressed by long-term Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater shortly before his death in 1998. Known for decades as Mr. Conservative, Goldwater championed Arizona water projects and voted for inundating Glen Canyon in the 1950s. But near the end of his life, when he was asked which vote during his 5-term Senate career he wished he could go back and change, he said it was his vote in support of Glen Canyon Dam. Water is important, he admitted, but it's not that important. Just last weekend, I returned to Glen Canyon for a backpacking trip to Willow Gulch. It was my 3rd visit to this particular drainage in 5 years. The resurgence of life I witnessed a few days ago was as powerful as my first trip there with Jim in 2004. I ran my hands through thickets of cattails along the recovered stream bed and pushed through walls of willow that have increasingly staked their claim. The place is exploding with mating species of all kinds, and the sweet sound of flowing water fills the air. The reservoir's high water mark in Willow Gulch now rises 100 feet and is flaking off like weathered paint, a relic to a previous era. With every hike into recovered Glen Canyon in recent years, I am always overwhelmed by the beauty of the place and the gravity of the current opportunity to act, or not. Here it is. The place everyone knew is the place no one knew, made famous because it was doomed. The place lost to 1950s environmental complacency and the trigger that led future activists to swear that such a devastating mistake would never happen again. Here it is, the tragically forsaken but miraculously resurrected Glen Canyon, standing dripping wet at our doorstep. What are we going to do? I'd like to invite Nikolai and Jim up, and we'll take questions.